An Earth engineer and an abandoned alien warrior teaming up to fight for freedom and daring to topple a mighty empire. Afi stood in front of the control panel, staring blankly at the array of flashing lights and faint beeps that hummed through the deserted corridors of the Lone Outpost, a solitary space station abandoned by the bustling networks of the Earth Federation. Years ago, it now stood as a ghost in the void. Its once vibrant communications array was long silent, and its crew, a mixture of engineers, scientists, and military personnel, had been reassigned or lost to time. He was the last one left. The station was tucked far from any major trade route, floating in the dark and desolate regions of deep space. Nothing passed through here except the occasional cargo ship, lost traders, and the rare unnoticed shuttle carrying supplies. For Afi, the isolation was a double-edged sword. His history, his war-torn past, was etched into the very fabric of who he had become. But here in this abandoned corner of the galaxy, he was free. Free from the ghosts of war that had once haunted his every step. Afi wasn't a man who was easily fazed by silence. His life on Earth had been filled with noise explosions, cries of pain, the incessant whine of battle-hardened machinery. He had been a war engineer, designing weapons and combat systems for the Earth Federation's endless campaigns against rival space empires. When the war had ended, he'd found himself without purpose, a man adrift in a world that had no place for him anymore. So he had volunteered to come here to the Lone Outpost, hoping to find something he had lost in the war peace. His days were spent in monotony, repairing broken systems, calibrating outdated machinery, and watching the stars. Afi often found himself staring out at the endless void of space, the stars seeming like distant promises of a world that had long since passed him by. In the stillness of the station, his thoughts were as deep as the darkness outside, where even light seemed hesitant to travel. Though Afi was human-born on Earth, he sometimes felt like an alien. His memories of the war were a fog of anguish. He had been a part of the conflict, building the very tools that had destroyed families and civilizations. He remembered the way his hands had trembled when he first saw the devastation his inventions had caused. It was that same feeling, guilt, that had driven him to isolate himself here. The war was over, but the battle within him raged on. His only company now were the occasional messages from Earth sent through automated systems that had long since ceased functioning properly. Every so often, he would receive an update on the status of the Federation or an automated reminder of his status as the sole occupant of the station. It was a quiet life, a life he had learned to accept. In fact, Afi had come to relish the solitude. He spent his free time reading old books, most of them military strategy manuals or engineering journals that no longer had much practical use. It was comforting in a strange way to hold something that reminded him of a life he once lived, even if it was a life he no longer recognized. But on this day, Afi's routine was interrupted. The silence his old companion was broken by an unexpected anomaly, a faint signal. It was weak, barely a whisper in the vast expanse of space, but it was there. His fingers hesitated over the console, and for a moment he thought it might just be a glitch, some stray piece of interference from a nearby star, or a malfunction in the station's old communication system. But then the signal pulsed again, its frequency unlike anything Afi had encountered before. Curiosity won over caution, and Afi's trained hands moved quickly to adjust the station's systems, trying to zero in on the source of the transmission. It wasn't a military signal, not from Earth or any of the known factions in this part of the galaxy. He hadn't encountered anything like it in the years he'd spent on the station. The pattern was strange, too structured to be a random anomaly, but too distorted to be an Earth origin signal. As he pulled up more data, his mind raced with possibilities. Pirates, smugglers, a forgotten distress call. None of it made sense, but there was no denying it. Someone or something was out there. Afi's instincts kicked in. As a war engineer, he had been trained to react quickly, to analyze and process threats without hesitation. His first thought was to report the signal to the Federation, but he quickly dismissed that. The Federation had forgotten about the Lone Outpost long ago. No one would be able to respond quickly enough, and by the time they did, it might be too late. This outpost had been abandoned for too long, and the supplies it held were outdated. The last thing the Federation needed was to expend resources on a station that no longer mattered. He was on his own. The signal seemed to be coming from an abandoned ship nearby. Its coordinates matched a derelict vessel that had been registered as missing for years. Afi frowned, pulling up a scan of the vessel. It was an older model, something from a time before the current military technologies had been standardized, and it had been reported lost without a trace after a failed mission. This ship alone in the dark expanse of space had sat forgotten, just like the station. A deep curiosity stirred within him, an urge to investigate. Perhaps there was something valuable on board, something that could make his days here less monotonous. He made the decision. Without thinking, Afi suited up in his space gear and prepared to launch the station's shuttle. He was not entirely sure why he felt so compelled to act. After all, his life on this outpost had been one of retreat, of avoiding danger, of leaving the past behind. But something about this signal, about the unknown ship drifting out there, called to him. The shuttle's engines roared to life as Afi piloted it into the vast emptiness, the stars stretching out before him in all their cold, indifferent beauty. His hands tightened around the controls as he set course for the ship, the signal growing stronger as he closed in on its source. He didn't know it yet, but in this moment his life was about to change forever. The desolate silence of the Lone Outpost was about to be shattered, and Afi would no longer be alone. Afi's shuttle drifted silently through the dark expanse of space, the only sound the hum of the engines as he approached the derelict ship. It was a haunting sight, a ghost of metal, its once pristine exterior, now battered and rusted, drifting aimlessly in the void. As he maneuvered the shuttle closer, his sensors picked up signs of life, faint but unmistakable. Someone or something was alive on that ship. Well, this is it, Afi muttered to himself, a mix of anticipation and caution settling in his chest. He ran a quick diagnostic check on his systems and prepared for docking. His heart beat faster than he expected. He hadn't expected a human presence on board. Was it a survivor, a trap? He didn't know, but the need to investigate was overwhelming. After all, who else would have ventured so far into the unknown? As he docked with the ship, the airlock opened with a hiss, releasing a cloud of stale, recycled air. He entered the ship's dark, narrow corridor, the low lighting casting long shadows on the walls. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he moved carefully forward. The ship had been abandoned for a long time. He could tell by the quiet, almost oppressive stillness of the environment. Still, he felt a faint pulse of energy, a glimmer of life somewhere deep within. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the eerie quiet. No response. He stepped further into the ship, the sound of his footsteps, the only noise to break the silence. Afi's eyes scanned the ship's dimly lit interior as he walked down the narrow hallway. It was a mess, as if the crew had fled in haste. Papers were scattered on the floor, old food containers left behind in disarray, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. It was clear that whoever had been here had long since abandoned ship, except for one thing. In the farthest chamber, nestled within a stasis pod, was a woman. Afi froze. The pod was sleek yet ancient, its surface covered in dust. The woman inside was suspended in a deep, unmoving slumber, her face peaceful yet pale. Her features were striking, sharp cheekbones, dark hair that framed her face in soft waves. Her skin was smooth and there was a delicate beauty to her, even in the lifeless state she was in. Her appearance suggested she had been there for a long time, but still she was alive. "Who are you?" Afi whispered under his breath as he moved closer to the pod, his eyes scanning the woman's unconscious form. It was clear that the technology surrounding her was far beyond what Earth engineers had ever designed. She was a mystery. His hand hovered over the control panel, uncertainty gnawing at him. Should he open it? What if this was some kind of trap? What if it wasn't a person at all, but something worse? His fingers hesitated, but his instincts honed in war, and survival told him that it was worth the risk. With a decisive movement, Afi activated the pod's release mechanism. The hiss of the stasis field deactivating echoed through the ship, and the pod's transparent door slid open, revealing the woman in all her vulnerability. At first, nothing happened, but then her eyes flickered open, slow, almost reluctant, as if she hadn't expected to awaken. She blinked rapidly, adjusting to the dim light around her. Afi took a step back, uncertain how to react. She wasn't moving aggressively, but her gaze was sharp, calculating. There was a moment of silence between them, one that stretched for what felt like an eternity. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse, but carrying a strength that surprised Afi. It wasn't the voice of someone disoriented or fragile, but of someone who had been through far more than they let on. Afi blinked, his mouth dry. He wasn't sure what to say, caught off guard by the calmness in her tone. I, I found your ship. I'm Afi from Earth. I, I don't know how long you've been here, but I thought you might need help. The woman's eyes narrowed as she slowly sat up, glancing around the room as if assessing her surroundings. Earth, she repeated, her voice flat. So you're human then? Afi nodded, taken aback by her sharpness. Yeah, that's right. You don't remember what happened, how you ended up here. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved her hand to her head, massaging her temple as if trying to recall something. I, I don't remember much, she admitted after a long pause. Just flashes. I know. I was created for something. For fighting. But that's all I can remember. Afi's heart tightened with an uncomfortable realization. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't just any ordinary person. She had been used, manipulated, turned into something by someone. His suspicion deepened. Fighting, created for war. Yes, she replied, her voice colder now. I was something like a weapon, but I wasn't supposed to be left behind. Afi furrowed his brow, the puzzle pieces beginning to come together. Who did this to you? The woman's gaze hardened. The Dominion, she said, her words carrying a heavy weight. They made me, and when I was no longer useful, they abandoned me. The Dominion, Afi repeated, his mind racing. He had heard the name before, but not in any context that was good. The Dominion was an empire, one that had spread its tyranny across galaxies for centuries. They were known for their brutal methods and ruthless military tactics. Why did they abandon you? Afi asked, stepping closer, his curiosity now fully piqued. Because I was no longer useful to them, she repeated with an air of finality. But that doesn't matter now. I'm awake, and I can fight back. Afi was stunned by the intensity in her voice. This woman, this warrior, wasn't just a survivor. She had a fire in her, something deep within her that refused to be broken. Well, Afi said after a long pause, breaking the tension, if you're awake, I guess we both have a lot of questions to answer. The woman, now standing, turned to face him. Then let's find those answers together. Her name was Havy, and she was far more than Afi had ever expected to find. And though their journey had just begun, he could already sense that things would never be the same. Afi led Havy through the corridors of the ship, the air still heavy with the scent of stagnation and forgotten time. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a rhythmic contrast to the chaos now simmering between them. She followed closely, her movements fluid yet cautious, like a predator just released from a cage, testing the limits of her newfound freedom. Afi noticed the way her gaze darted around, scanning everything, as though each corner of the ship held a potential threat or perhaps a hidden truth. So you don't remember much? Afi asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence that hung between them. You were created for war, but there's a lot missing. Havy nodded, her expression unreadable. Flashes, memories, but they're fragmented. A lot of it is blank. She paused as if the weight of those empty spaces was heavy on her mind. I know I was made to fight. I know I've been used, discarded, but nothing about why I was created. No, reason behind it. Her voice faltered for a moment before steadying again. The Dominion's designs were efficient. They wanted soldiers without weaknesses, no emotions, no doubts. Afi felt a pang of sympathy, but he quickly pushed it aside. Sympathy didn't help in situations like this. Action did. He could sense Havy's frustration. It was written in the tension in her shoulders, the way her fists clenched at her sides as if to control a storm raging inside her. They must have been real monsters, Afi said, more to himself than to her. Creating you, using you like that, and then just leaving you behind. Havy's eyes darkened, her lips tightening into a thin line. Monsters don't leave behind their tools when they're no longer useful. They dispose of them. She turned toward Afi, her gaze intense. I wasn't a person to them. I was a weapon. Afi stopped walking and turned to face her, fully studying her for a moment. There was something about the way she carried herself, a grace even in the midst of her confusion, that drew him in. She wasn't just a soldier. She wasn't just a machine or an experiment. There was humanity in her, a depth that couldn't be erased no matter how hard they tried. Well, you're a person to me, Afi said, his voice firm. And right now, I think we both need to figure out how to stay alive because the Dominion is going to come looking for you." Havy's sharp eyes locked onto his. "They already are," she said, her voice low. "I can feel them, even now in the back of my mind. They'll send someone for me. They always do." Afi's gut tightened. He knew the Dominion's reach. Once they realized that one of their most valuable creations had been abandoned, they would stop at nothing to reclaim her. And from the way Havy spoke, it was clear she knew exactly how dangerous they were. "We need to leave," Afi said, his voice urgent now. "We need to get back to the station. The shuttle's waiting. We can hide there for now." Havy shook her head, her eyes flashing with defiance. "Hiding won't save us," she said, her tone colder than before. "Running won't change what I am or what they'll do to us." Her hand clenched into a fist. "I'm not running anymore. I'm done with that." Afi blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected this kind of resolve from her. She'd been confused, disoriented, doubtful even, but now there was something different in the air. Something in her had shifted. She wasn't the frightened soldier who had woken up in a stasis pod anymore. This was a woman who had reclaimed a part of herself that had been buried long ago. "You're saying we fight back?" Afi asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. Havy's gaze met his. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I'm going to make sure they know they can't just use me like a tool, then toss me aside. They'll regret abandoning me." Afi nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It was one thing to think about running. It was another thing entirely to consider standing your ground when the enemy was as powerful as the Dominion. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized Havy was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. They had to face the enemy head-on, or they wouldn't survive. "All right," Afi said, taking a deep breath. "Then let's do this. We need to find a way to fight back, to find a weakness in the Dominion system. You're not the only one who's been left in the dark. There's a lot I don't know about the Dominion either. But together, maybe we can find a way." Havy studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Together," she echoed, as if the word tasted new on her tongue. "All right, Afi, together." There was something in the air between them now, something heavier than before. A shared understanding. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by fate. Now they were allies, partners, and perhaps in time, something more. The question was no longer if they would fight back, but how they would do it. "Let's start with the basics." Afi said, his mind already beginning to calculate their next move. "I've been stuck here for years with nothing but old data, but I've still got access to the station's mainframe. If we can tap into it, we might be able to find something, anything that can give us an edge." Havy nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Then we start there. The station's systems. It's old, but it might hold answers." She paused and then added, her tone more serious. "We'll need more than just information. I'm not sure I can control the full extent of my powers yet, but I'll try." Afi grinned, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out. We're not alone in this anymore." And with that, the two of them turned toward the shuttle, ready to face the unknown future together. There were many questions still unanswered about Havy's origins, about the Dominion, about what she was capable of, but one thing was certain: they were no longer running from the past. They were fighting for the future. The shuttle's engines hummed softly as it glided away from the abandoned ship. But Afi knew they weren't safe. Not yet. The stars outside the cockpit window stretched into thin lines as they sped through the emptiness. But the darkness of space felt different now, as if it had become more oppressive. Somewhere out there, the Dominion's eyes were watching, calculating, and soon enough they would be coming for Havy. Afi glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Havy was focused on the view outside the shuttle, her sharp gaze scanning the horizon as if she could sense the coming storm. Despite her calm demeanor, Afi could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched the armrests like she was ready for a fight at any moment. He wasn't sure if she was more worried about the Dominion catching up with them or confronting the truth of who she really was. "We don't have much time," Afi said, his voice low. "We need to get back to the station and figure out a plan. Once we're there, we can secure the systems, lock down the station," and Havy cut him off with a sharp, clipped voice. "They'll find us before we can get to the station." Afi's brow furrowed. "You don't know that for sure." "I know," she replied, her voice taut with the weight of unspoken knowledge. The Dominion never leaves things to chance. They will track us. They'll use their systems to monitor every signal, every electronic pulse. They'll be coming for me, and when they do, they'll stop at nothing. Afi glanced at the navigation display. The route to the Lone Outpost wasn't long, but even the shortest of distances could feel like an eternity when there was a predator on your tail. He swallowed hard, gripping the controls tighter as the full reality of their situation sank in. The Dominion didn't just pursue their targets, they hunted them. And Havy to them was a prize, a lost weapon they wanted back. It wasn't long before Afi's suspicion turned into certainty. The comm system crackled, and the cold, calculated voice of a Dominion officer filled the shuttle's speakers, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Unknown vessel, you are entering Dominion-controlled space. Power down your engines and prepare for immediate boarding. Failure to comply will result in destruction. The words were devoid of emotion, mechanical, as though the officer had delivered the same command countless times before to countless other victims. Afi's heart raced and he quickly glanced at Havy. Her face had gone pale, the color draining from her features, as the reality of their imminent capture hit her like a slap in the face. But there was no time for hesitation. She immediately sprang into action, her fingers flying over the shuttle's control panel, her movements swift and precise. "We need to move faster," she muttered under her breath, voice sharp. "I can't outrun them, not with their tracking technology. We have to evade." Afi interrupted, his mind already working through the options. "We don't have the firepower to outrun them, but we might be able to outsmart them. They're used to predictable tactics. We need to get creative." Havy shot him a look, her expression unreadable for a moment before she nodded. "I've hacked into their systems before. But this," she glanced at Afi, her voice hardening. "This is different. They won't just let us slip away." "They never do," Afi said grimly. "But I've worked on enough weapons to know how they think. If we can disable their pursuit systems or at least throw them off our trail." Havy nodded. "I'll do my part. You just get us out of here." The shuttle surged forward, its engines roaring as Afi pushed the throttle to the limit, sending the small vessel hurtling toward the vast emptiness of space. He knew the risks. They were high, but the longer they stayed on course, the more the Dominion would close in. They needed to break their pursuit, and fast. Afi pulled the shuttle into a sharp dive, twisting and turning through the deep void of space. The stars outside blurred as they veered toward an asteroid field, hoping that the dense rocks would provide some cover, at least long enough for Havy to work her magic. The shuttle rattled as it flew through the debris-filled pieces of rock, smashing against the hull as they dodged and weaved through the dangerous terrain. Afi's heart hammered in his chest as his fingers danced across the controls, his every move calculated, every shift in velocity designed to throw off their pursuers. It wasn't just about speed, it was about unpredictability. If the Dominion couldn't predict their next move, they couldn't catch them. "You're doing great," Havy said suddenly, her voice steady, though Afi could hear the tension in it. "But we're running out of time. They'll adapt quickly. Just keep working on their systems." Afi said, his voice tight with concentration. "We need to make it harder for them to track us. Disable their radar, scramble their signals, anything." Havy nodded, her eyes flicking back and forth between the control panel and the window as she accessed the Dominion systems. Her fingers flew across the screen, manipulating lines of code that Afi couldn't even begin to understand. Her brow furrowed, a look of deep focus on her face as she pushed her own limits. Suddenly the comms crackled again, a voice cutting through the static. "Vessel, you are defying orders. Prepare to be destroyed." "Not today," Afi muttered under his breath, swerving the shuttle between two large asteroids, narrowly avoiding a collision. He could feel his hands shaking as the adrenaline surged, but there was no time to think about it. His mind was racing with calculations, with strategies he'd learned as a war engineer, applied now to this desperate escape. Come on," Havy muttered, her voice tense as she bypassed another layer of Dominion firewalls. "Got it." Afi glanced at her in confusion, but just then the display flickered as the radar signal from the Dominion's pursuit ships vanished. Afi couldn't believe it. Havy had done it. "We're clear," she said, her voice carrying both relief and exhaustion. "For now, but they won't stop. We've only delayed them." Afi let out a long breath, his grip on the controls loosening slightly. They had bought themselves some time, but it was only temporary. The Dominion wouldn't stop hunting them, not after what Havy represented. Not after everything she knew, and neither of them was naive enough to think they could outrun the Empire forever. Still, for the moment, they had escaped. "Nice work," Afi said, turning to her with a small, appreciative smile. Havy met his gaze, her expression softening for the first time since their escape began. "You did your part too, Afi," she said quietly. "I don't know if I could have done it alone." Afi's smile grew, but he didn't reply. Instead, he let the silence between them settle, filled with understanding. They were no longer just a human and a warrior, an engineer and an experiment. They were partners, survivors, linked together by a shared goal. "We've got a long road ahead," Afi said, turning his gaze back to the stars. "But we're still alive. And we'll stay that way," Havy replied firmly, her resolve evident, "for as long as it takes." And as the shuttle continued its journey through the void, Afi knew that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just fleeing the past, he was fighting for a future. With Havy at his side, that future felt a little bit more possible. The shuttle glided silently through the depths of space, a lone speck in the vast empty expanse. Afi kept his hands steady on the controls, but his mind was racing. The Dominion's pursuit had been temporarily stalled, but their next move was inevitable. And Havy, though safe for now, was still grappling with the realization that her entire life had been a lie. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a weapon discarded like an old tool, left to fade into the cold abyss of space. It wasn't a fate anyone could accept easily. Havy sat in the seat next to him, her eyes closed, her body still. She had barely spoken since they'd escaped the asteroid field. Afi couldn't help but glance over at her, noticing the subtle tension in her posture. He could tell she was thinking, processing, wrestling with the chaos of her past. She was trying to understand what had happened to her, trying to find herself in the fragments of memories that seemed to betray her at every turn. For all her strength, Afi knew she was fighting a battle inside her that was far from over. She wasn't just running from the Dominion anymore. She was running from the very person they had turned her into. And in a way, Afi was running with her. They both had their demons to confront, but for now, all they could do was keep moving forward. The hum of the engines seemed to fill the silence as the shuttle continued its course toward the Lone Outpost. Afi glanced at the console, checking their systems one last time before he broke the stillness between them. "You've been quiet," he said softly. "Are you okay?" Havy's eyes opened slowly, and she turned to him, her gaze steady but distant. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. It was almost as if she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "You don't have to say that," Afi said, his tone gentle. "I get it. You've been through more than anyone should ever have to, but you don't have to carry this alone." Havy's lips pressed together as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I've been alone for a long time, Afi. The Dominion made sure of that. They gave me no room for weakness, no space to be human." She hesitated, her eyes flicking down to her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I was made for one thing, to fight, to be an instrument, and then when they didn't need me anymore, they cast me aside." Afi leaned back in his seat, his hands still on the controls, but his eyes focused entirely on her. He understood that she wasn't just talking about the Dominion, she was talking about her entire existence. How could she reconcile the warrior they had made her into with the person she was becoming? "I think you're more than what they made you," Afi said softly. "What they wanted you to be. You're not just a weapon. You're Havy. You have your own heart, your own mind. And I know it's hard to see that now, but you're not alone. You don't have to be that weapon anymore." For a long moment, Havy didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on her hands, the space between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "But who am I, Afi? If I'm not a weapon, then what am I? I don't know who I am anymore. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now." Afi's heart tightened, but he didn't look away. "Maybe you don't have to have all the answers right now," he said. "Maybe for now you can just focus on being you. Just you. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Havy's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, Afi thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Something human, something real. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft hum of the shuttle's engines. The distance between them had shrunk not because of proximity, but because of the understanding that had begun to take root. Afi knew there was no simple solution to Havy's struggles, no easy path for her to reclaim her identity. But for the first time, she seemed to be accepting that she didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to be perfect. She could simply be herself, and that was enough. The ship's navigation system pinged, pulling Afi's attention back to the console. "We're almost at the station," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. Havy nodded, her expression more focused now. "Good. We'll need to secure the systems before the Dominion catches up with us. And I need to prepare myself. I'm not sure what they'll throw at us next, but I'll be ready." Afi smiled, nodding in agreement. "We'll be ready. Together." For the first time since they had fled the Dominion's clutches, a small sense of peace settled over him. He knew the road ahead would be perilous. They would face dangers they couldn't yet imagine, and Havy's struggle to find her true identity would be far from over. But as long as they had each other, he believed they could face whatever came next. As the shuttle approached the dark expanse of the Lone Outpost, a quiet resolve filled the space between them. They had come a long way, but the fight was only just beginning. Together, they would not just survive. They would fight to reclaim the freedom that had been stolen from them both. And in doing so, perhaps they would finally find the answers they had been searching for. The Lone Outpost loomed ahead, its dark silhouette standing stark against the vast emptiness of space. Afi stared at it as they approached the site of the station, usually a source of comfort, but this time it felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, a tension that made his heart beat just a little faster. The past few days had been a whirlwind, and now they were about to dock in what was supposed to be their sanctuary. Havy, sitting beside him, didn't speak. Afi could feel her presence, the quiet determination in her posture. She was watching the station's lights flicker weakly on the console, the same dim lights that had once been a signal of safety. "Almost there," Afi said softly, trying to steady the unease gnawing at his insides. "We can secure the systems once we dock. We'll be safe." Havy didn't respond at first, her eyes still fixed on the distant station. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but there was something heavy in it. "We'll see." Afi turned his attention back to the station, a creeping sense of dread beginning to settle in. Something didn't feel right. The comm signal from the station wasn't coming through properly. Normally there would be an automated greeting, or at least some communication, but this time everything was silent. The lights on the station flickered intermittently. "What's going on?" Afi muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the readings on the console. Havy looked over at the flashing lights and then back to him, her expression unreadable. "Could be a glitch," she said, though her tone lacked certainty. "But it doesn't feel like one." Afi frowned. The station had been abandoned for years, but the Federation had left basic systems in place to keep it functional. A malfunction of this magnitude wasn't something that happened by accident. Something was off, and his instincts told him they were walking straight into a trap. "Stay alert," Afi said, his voice firm. "We need to be ready for anything." As the shuttle docked, Afi prepared himself for whatever lay ahead. The moment the hatch opened, cold air rushed into the shuttle, carrying with it the scent of stale machinery and long-forgotten corners of the outpost. There was no welcome team, no technicians, just the ominous silence of an abandoned place. Afi moved cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol at his side. He had grown used to the quiet of space, but this silence felt different. It wasn't the usual isolation of the outpost. It felt like something was waiting, something was watching. "Stay close," Afi whispered, his voice barely audible. "I have a bad feeling about this." Havy, who had already unstrapped herself, didn't need further instructions. She moved swiftly to his side, her body tense, every muscle coiled for action. They both knew what it meant when things were too quiet. As they stepped into the docking bay, Afi's senses sharpened. The space was vast, dark, and the lights buzzed faintly overhead. The only sounds were the low hum of the station systems and the soft echo of their footsteps. It felt abandoned, like they had walked into an empty tomb. "Something's wrong," Afi muttered. "This doesn't feel right." Havy's eyes narrowed as she scanned their surroundings. "I feel it too." Suddenly, Afi froze. There was movement from the shadows, quick and deliberate. Something was out there, and Afi didn't like the feeling that crept over him. He motioned for Havy to stay close as they moved into a nearby alcove, hiding their figures in the dim light. A figure stepped into the bay, a solitary silhouette emerging from the shadows. At first, Afi thought it might be a technician or a crew member who had stayed behind, but then the figure's uniform came into view. Black and red insignia, the unmistakable emblem of the Dominion, a soldier. Afi's pulse quickened, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The soldier's face was hidden by the shadow of his helmet, but his posture was confident, too confident. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the soldier said, his voice cold and casual. He didn't seem concerned about the two of them at all. "You really thought you could hide on a station like this?" Afi's grip tightened on his pistol. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady. "How did you find us?" The soldier's lips curled into a smirk. "The Dominion doesn't need to find you. We're always watching, always tracking. Did you really think a little hiding place in the middle of nowhere would protect you?" Afi's mind raced, but he didn't let his guard slip. "The station was supposed to be abandoned," he said. "You weren't supposed to be here." The soldier chuckled, a cold, unsettling sound. "Oh, it was abandoned, at first. But once the Dominion realized what they'd lost, they made sure someone stayed. And now look here, you are walking right into our hands." The weight of the betrayal hit Afi like a punch to the gut. They had been walking into a trap the whole time. The station had never been abandoned. The Dominion had been waiting for them, setting them up from the very beginning. "You were waiting for us," Afi said through gritted teeth. "You knew we'd come back." "Of course we did," the soldier replied with a shrug. "You gave us everything we needed when you used the station's systems. It was only a matter of time before we caught up with you." Afi's mind raced, calculating their options. He had known they couldn't outrun the Dominion forever, but to be betrayed like this so thoroughly left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. Without warning, more figures emerged from the shadows, armed soldiers, stepping out from hidden alcoves surrounding them with cold precision. The trap had been set, and they had walked straight into it. Havy shifted next to Afi, her muscles tensing, ready for a fight. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Not without a fight." Afi's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't let his fear show. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The odds were stacked against them. They were outnumbered and the station was compromised. But as long as he and Havy were still standing, they weren't done yet. "We're not finished," Afi said firmly, his gaze locking with Havy's. "We fight. Together." The soldiers didn't move their guns trained on the two of them, but Afi knew that this wasn't the end. Not yet. This was just the beginning of their fight. The silence in the docking bay was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the station's failing systems. Afi and Havy stood surrounded by the cold, calculating eyes of the Dominion soldiers, their guns raised and aimed directly at them. But Afi wasn't about to go down without a fight, and neither was Havy. She stood beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on the soldiers. Her breathing was steady, controlled, almost unnervingly calm, as though she had already made peace with the coming battle. But Afi could sense it in her, too. The tension building beneath the surface, the storm ready to break. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his weapon still aimed at them. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," he said, his voice low and filled with a sick sense of satisfaction. "This is your last chance. Surrender now and we might make it quick." Afi's fingers tightened around the grip of his sidearm, but he didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he glanced at Havy, his eyes silently asking for her move. She wasn't just a victim here. She was more than that now. She had become a force to be reckoned with, a warrior who was done being hunted. "I've had enough of being their tool," Havy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's time to show them what happens when you push too far." With that, she stepped forward, her movements graceful yet determined. The soldiers didn't flinch. They were trained to react quickly, but what happened next was something none of them were prepared for. Havy's hand shot out in one fluid motion, her fingers brushing the air in front of her. The next instant, the lights around the bay flickered violently, casting brief, strobe-like flashes of light that made the soldiers' movements jerky and uncertain. Afi's heart raced as he watched her, trying to comprehend what was happening. It was as if Havy were manipulating the very systems of the station, the power grid bending to her will. She was hacking them. The soldiers froze, confusion flickering in their eyes. The lights went out completely, leaving them in complete darkness for a moment. The sound of rapid breathing of shifting bodies echoed in the blackness. Afi didn't wait. He moved swiftly, ducking down and grabbing a small discarded piece of metal from the floor. He threw it at the nearest soldier, hitting him square in the chest. The man stumbled backward, giving Afi enough time to leap into action, his sidearm raised. But it wasn't Afi's move that made the difference. It was Havy. The darkness flickered again as Havy's power surged through the station's failing systems. Lights flashed back on, bright and harsh, blinding the soldiers for a split second. And in that moment, she unleashed a pulse of energy so intense that it sent ripples through the walls of the station. Afi watched in awe as the soldiers' weapons began to malfunction, their targeting systems scrambling. The once efficient Dominion technology had turned against its masters, sending sparks flying from their guns and disabling their communication systems. The soldiers were left disoriented and panicked, unable to respond to the chaos unfolding around them. "Get down!" Havy shouted to Afi, her voice filled with urgency. Afi didn't hesitate. He dropped to the floor, his instincts kicking in as he aimed his pistol at the nearest soldier, firing once. The shot rang out loud and sharp, and the soldier crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his hand. The others hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening, and that was all the time Afi and Havy needed. With the system's interference still in full force, the remaining soldiers struggled to regain control. It was their fatal mistake. Havy's power surged again, and one by one, the Dominion soldiers dropped their weapons, their systems locking down under her influence. In the chaos, she moved with precision, disabling the remaining soldiers with swift, calculated strikes. She wasn't just a weapon, she was the weapon. When the last soldier hit the ground, the station fell into a heavy silence. Afi stood up slowly, his breathing heavy, his heart racing from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Havy stood in front of him, her chest rising and falling as she recovered from the burst of energy. You did that?" Afi asked, disbelief in his voice. His gaze swept over the fallen soldiers. "How?" Havy turned to face him, her face calm, but there was a spark of something new in her eyes, something fierce, something that had been dormant until now. "I didn't know I could do that until just now," she said, her voice still carrying that underlying note of shock. "It's like a piece of me clicked into place, something buried deep inside me." Afi's eyes softened as he looked at her. He had seen her struggle, seen her question who she was, what she was meant to be. But now there was no doubt in his mind. Havy wasn't just a weapon. She was far more than that. She was learning to control the power that had once been used to destroy, to reshape herself into something new. "You're not just a weapon," Afi said quietly. "You're more than that, Havy. You're yourself." Havy smiled faintly, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure what her future held, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. She had found something inside her, something powerful, something real. And maybe that was enough to face whatever was coming next. "We need to move," Afi said, breaking the moment. "The Dominion won't be far behind. Let's get to the control room and secure the station before they send reinforcements." Havy nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's go. This isn't over yet." As they moved deeper into the station, the two of them were no longer just fugitives running from the past. They were fighters ready to take on whatever the Dominion would throw at them. And together they knew they had a chance to rewrite their fate. The quiet hum of the Lone Outpost central control room was only interrupted by the soft clatter of Afi's fingers flying over the console. The room, dimly lit by flickering emergency lights, was littered with outdated equipment, many of which were long obsolete by modern standards. Yet despite the decay, it still held a certain weight to it. This place had once been a center of operations. Now it was a battleground, a strategic point in their fight for survival. Afi glanced over at Havy, who was standing by the control panel, her expression focused. She had found a way to reroute the station systems, locking down the more vulnerable areas and disabling any active Dominion surveillance networks they might have missed. Still, he knew that this would only buy them time. The Dominion was relentless, and their pursuit would only get worse as they realized the scale of their loss. "We need help," Afi said quietly as he continued to work on securing the station. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes scanning the various terminal screens. His mind was racing through the options, all while the weight of their situation pressed down on him. It was only a matter of time before reinforcements from the Dominion arrived, and then all of this, the small victory, The slight moment of peace would be over. Earth doesn't even know we're here, Havy said, glancing up at him. Her voice held an edge of doubt but also determination. We're out of their range. Afi nodded. He knew that. The outpost had been left in a remote region of space far beyond the reach of standard Federation patrols. This wasn't supposed to be a strategic location anymore. It was supposed to be abandoned. The Federation had no idea that it was still functional or that anyone was still using it. But the truth was, he needed their help. He couldn't fight the Dominion alone, and neither could Havy. They needed reinforcements, and they needed them fast. Afi stood up, glancing at the terminal. We can use the long-range comms. I've bypassed the interference. It's a risk, but if I can get a signal through, we can reach Earth. We'll need their support. Otherwise, we'll never make it. Havy looked at him, her eyes narrowing in thought. You think they'll respond? The Federation hasn't shown interest in the outpost for years. Maybe they won't, Afi said, his voice hard. But we've got no other choice. If we're going to make it out of here, we need them. Earth needs to know what's going on. The Dominion is more dangerous than they realize. Havy didn't argue, but the skepticism was clear in her eyes. You think Earth will send reinforcements in time? By the time they respond, the Dominion could already have us cornered. Afi's jaw clenched. He didn't have time to argue. He didn't have time for doubts. The longer they waited, the worse it would get. He had to act now. Earth doesn't know what's happening here, Afi said, his voice tinged with urgency. But I know the Federation. They're not going to sit back and watch this happen, not when they realize the Dominion is back in full force. We're not the only ones they've been hunting. They've got their eyes on a lot more than just this station. He turned back to the comms panel, dialing in the frequencies as quickly as his fingers would allow. His mind flashed back to his days with the Federation, his work on the war machines, the countless late nights spent patching together tech to keep their military at the cutting edge. He'd been a soldier, once a part of a system that had sent people like him to die in the name of some larger cause. He had left that life behind, but now the war had come back to him in a way he could no longer avoid. This is Lieutenant Afi Soler. He spoke into the comms unit, his voice steady despite the urgency rising in his chest. To Federation Command, this is a distress call from the Lone Outpost Sector 467D. The Dominion has resurfaced. We need immediate reinforcements. They've already compromised the station, and we're under heavy attack. If anyone's out there, we need help now. Afi let the words hang in the air for a moment before he pressed the transmission button once more, broadcasting his message to any open Federation channels. The static that followed felt like an eternity. Every second that passed was another second the Dominion could use to gain the upper hand. Havy stood a little farther back, watching him carefully, her gaze calculating. She didn't voice her concerns aloud, but Afi could feel them. She had spent far too much time being betrayed by those who made her. Could she really trust Earth? Could she trust the Federation to respond in time? Afi didn't have those answers, but he knew one thing: the Federation had the resources. They had the manpower. And even if it took time, even if it took longer than they could afford, he had to believe they would come. Because without them, they had no chance. Come on, Afi muttered under his breath, staring at the comms panel as the seconds ticked by. Come on, Earth. The silence on the other end of the transmission felt like a slow suffocation. But then the static buzzed once more, louder than before. It wasn't the usual dead silence of a lost signal. It was something more. A brief crackle of recognition. This is Federation Command, a voice said, coming through the static, rough and fragmented. Lieutenant Soler, we read you. This is Commander Zara Calix. You've been offline for too long. What's your situation? Afi exhaled sharply, a sense of relief flooding through him. They were still there. They were listening, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I need immediate assistance, Afi said, his voice tightening with urgency. The Dominion has returned. The Lone Outpost is compromised. We're not the only station under attack. We're outnumbered and outgunned. If you don't send reinforcements now, we won't make it. Akrin Om. There was a long pause on the other end of the transmission. Afi's heart pounded in his chest as the silence stretched on. Then finally the voice of Commander Calix returned. We've received your transmission, Lieutenant. Reinforcements are on their way. Stand your ground. We'll reach you as soon as possible. Stay in contact and we'll send coordinates once we have the fleet in position. You'll need to hold the outpost until then. Understood, Afi said, nodding to himself. The words didn't bring the immediate relief he had hoped for, but they were a start. He wasn't alone anymore. The Federation was coming, just not fast enough. Afi turned to Havy, his expression hardened. Reinforcements are on the way. Earth's sending help, but we need to buy as much time as we can. Havy's eyes flickered with something between relief and skepticism, but she nodded. Let's make sure they don't find a way to shut us down before that help arrives. Afi took a deep breath, turning back to the control panel. The time they had left was uncertain, but now they had a glimmer of hope. The Dominion wouldn't stop, not until they had reclaimed everything they believed was theirs. But for the first time, Afi knew that they were no longer just fleeing from a hopeless fight. They were about to make one final stand, and they would fight until they had nothing left. The hours stretched long as Afi and Havy worked tirelessly, reinforcing the station's defenses and making the final preparations for the inevitable Dominion attack. The control room had become their makeshift war room, filled with holographic displays and blinking lights as they rerouted power-fortified entrances and activated every possible security measure. Their hands were moving faster now, driven by a shared understanding that their time was running out. Afi couldn't shake the weight of the situation, but he knew there was no time to dwell on it. Their survival hinged on how effectively they could hold off the Dominion forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, but with every system they secured, a small spark of hope flickered inside him. Havy was at the main terminal, her fingers flying over the screen as she adjusted the station's shield generators. Despite the mounting pressure, she was calm, too calm for someone who had spent her life being used as a tool of war. He had expected her to break, to show some sign of the emotional strain she had been under, but instead she worked with precision. It was a trait that Afi had come to admire, even if it made him wonder just how much of her humanity had been buried beneath the layers of her past. "You're doing great," Afi said, his voice a quiet encouragement. He leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the terminal, though he didn't fully understand all the details. "We're almost there." Havy didn't look up, but she nodded once, her eyes scanning the cascading data as she tightened the station's security. "Just need to make sure we don't leave any weak spots," she replied, her tone steady. "I can feel them coming. We can't afford to make any mistakes now." Afi took a step back, watching her work. There was something about the way she handled herself that left him in awe. Her transformation from the confused, abandoned warrior he had first met to this unyielding focus force had been almost instantaneous. She had adapted, taken control, and learned to harness the very power she had once feared. They had learned to rely on each other in ways Afi hadn't expected. He was used to working alone, having spent years in isolation at the outpost. But with Havy at his side, the job felt less like a struggle for survival and more like a shared mission. She had taught him to push past his doubts, to keep moving, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. And in return, Afi had become her anchor, the one person who could bring her back when her mind raced too far into the darkness of her past. The connection between them was undeniable now, though neither of them had fully articulated it. There were no grand gestures, no declarations. It was more subtle than that. It was in the way they instinctively watched each other's backs, in the way their silence was comfortable, their shared resolve, a quiet understanding. "How long do you think we have?" Afi asked, breaking the silence, though he already knew the answer. Havy's fingers paused over the terminal, her expression momentarily distant, as if she were listening for something. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of the station's systems. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "The Dominion is calculating. They'll come at us from multiple angles. We can't predict their exact move." Afi nodded, absorbing her words. He knew the danger they were in. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. The fight wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about getting through this attack. It was about what came after. If they survived, they had to figure out who they were, what they wanted from this fight. "You know," Afi said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, "I used to think I was just a cog in a machine. That's how I saw myself, just a part of a bigger plan. But now I think we get to decide what happens next. We're not anyone's tool anymore. We get to fight for what we believe in." Havy turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. For a brief moment, she looked almost surprised. It was the first time Afi had truly seen the vulnerability that she had kept hidden for so long. She didn't say anything at first, her gaze shifting back to the screen in front of her, but then she spoke. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was just something to be used, something to be controlled. But with you, it's different." Afi didn't need to say anything. The weight of her words settled between them, not as a confession, but as a simple truth. The bond they shared wasn't about the circumstances they had been thrown into. It was about what they chose to do with those circumstances. They had no control over their past, but they had complete control over their future. "You're not alone anymore," Afi said, his voice steady. "Neither of us are." Havy looked at him again, and for the first time there was something softer in her expression, something that had been hidden beneath the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't just gratitude or the fleeting emotion of the moment, it was an acknowledgement. They were in this together. Just then the station's alarms blared, breaking the fragile silence that had settled between them. Afi's heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the control panel. The screen flickered to life, showing multiple Dominion vessels on approach. "They're here," Havy said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. Afi didn't waste a second. "Get to the weapon systems," he said, already moving toward the station's defensive control panels. "We'll hold them off as long as we can. Earth's reinforcements are on the way. We just need to keep them busy long enough for them to get here." Havy nodded without a word, her focus shifting immediately to the task at hand. Together they had faced the unknown. Together they had fought for survival, and now together they would face the full force of the Dominion. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their future. As the first blast of enemy fire rocked the station, Afi felt a sense of clarity settle in his chest. They weren't alone. They weren't just fighting to escape. They were fighting to take back control, and they weren't going to stop. The first wave of Dominion fire hit the station with a thunderous crash, rattling the walls and sending sparks flying from exposed circuits. The vibration shook the very foundations of the Lone Outpost, a reminder of the full force of the enemy they were about to face. Afi's heart hammered in his chest as the alarms blared louder, red lights flashing in rapid succession across the control room. His eyes darted between the weapon systems and Havy, who had already locked herself into a defensive position near the central hub. "This is it," Afi muttered, his voice low and steady, though his mind was racing. "We hold them off as long as we can." Havy gave him a quick, focused nod, her fingers flying over the terminal in front of her. Her movements were precise, each key press a calculated effort to fortify their position. Afi moved to the weapons panel, pulling up the station's defensive grid. He had seen these systems before, but only in simulations. Now it was real, and the weight of that reality hit him hard. "We've got a couple of minutes before they hit the outer defenses." Afi said, his hands moving quickly over the controls. "We need to disable their long-range artillery before they can break through." Havy was already ahead of him. "I'm taking care of their surveillance. If we can block their targeting systems, we can at least keep them blind for a while." The two of them moved in sync, their focus singular. Afi's mind was sharp, every motion driven by the urgency of the moment. The Dominion was coming, and they were outnumbered. But they weren't going down without a fight. They were in this together, and that gave Afi a renewed strength he hadn't known he had before. Outside, the Dominion fleet continued to close in their ships, moving with a precision that only an empire like theirs could muster. Afi's hands trembled slightly as he worked, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't. Not now. There was no room for hesitation, no time for fear. 10 seconds until the first volley. Afi warned, his eyes scanning the weapon's readouts. "We've got to buy more time." "Working on it," Havy replied, her voice steady but filled with urgency. She wasn't just typing commands into the console. She was hacking into the Dominion's communication lines, scrambling their signals, creating chaos in their targeting systems. Every second she bought them was another chance at survival. The first wave of fire came crashing into the station's outer defenses. The station groaned as the shields took the brunt of the damage, a deep rumble reverberating through the hallways. Sparks flew from the nearby terminals, and Afi's grip on the control panel tightened as he read the damage reports coming in. Their shields were holding, but just barely. If the Dominion launched another full assault, they would breach the station within minutes. "Shields are at 60%, Afi said, his voice tense. We need to disable their weapons or we won't last long. Havy's hands were a blur as she worked furiously at the terminal, pulling up command lines, bypassing security protocols, and decrypting Dominion systems faster than Afi could follow. He watched in awe as she unlocked new layers of defense that he hadn't even known were possible. Got it, Havy said, her voice low with satisfaction. I've sent a virus into their targeting systems. They'll be blind for the next few minutes. Afi grinned, though his focus never wavered. That's enough time to take them down. The control room shook again, and Afi's eyes snapped to the weapons console. The Dominion wasn't giving up. They were relentless, pouring fire into the station's weakened defenses. Afi's fingers flew over the console, locking onto the nearest enemy ships in range. The targeting systems flashed green as they synced with the station's artillery grid. Afi pulled the trigger without hesitation, and the station's cannons fired in rapid succession, their blasts lighting up the dark expanse of space. Direct hit, Afi said, his voice rising with a mix of relief and determination. We've disabled one of their warships. Keep the pressure on them. But even as the first enemy ship spun off course, taking heavy damage, Afi could hear the sound of more ships entering range. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Keep hitting them. Afi, Havy urged, her voice unwavering as she monitored the incoming data. They'll keep coming, but we have the advantage for now. We just need to buy more time. Afi worked faster now, his every action fluid and instinctual. His training as a war engineer, though years out of use, kicked in with frightening precision. His hands moved quickly across the console, bringing up targeting lines, calculating trajectories, and launching additional strikes against the incoming fleet. The station's weapons were limited, but the damage they were causing was starting to add up. We're pushing them back, Afi said, but there was no time to celebrate. He knew this was just the beginning. The Dominion would send wave after wave until they either overwhelmed the station or captured its most valuable asset, Havy. Havy's voice broke through the tension. Afi, we've got another problem. She turned to him, her eyes locked onto the screens. They're sending reinforcements. Bigger ships. We won't hold them off much longer with these defenses. Afi didn't need her to tell him. The incoming fleet was larger than before. They were preparing for a final decisive push. The space around them was now filled with the silhouette of Dominion warships, their weapons primed and ready. We've got one shot at this, Afi said, his voice grim. We need to disable their command ship. If we take out their leader, the rest of the fleet will lose cohesion. Havy's eyes burned with intensity. I can hack their navigation systems, but I'll need you to keep their attention on us. We need to draw them in close enough for me to make a move. Afi turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't need to say anything. He trusted her, and he knew she trusted him. Together they would make this work. I'll keep them busy, Afi said. You do what you do best. With that, the two of them moved into position, Afi focusing all his attention on the incoming reinforcements, while Havy began rerouting the station's systems to give them an edge. They were running out of time, but for the first time since this battle began, Afi felt a sense of hope flicker inside him. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back, and they would win together. The battle outside the Lone Outpost raged with an intensity Afi had only seen in the darkest days of the war. The air within the station was thick with tension, the hum of machinery and the blare of alarms surrounding them as they fought tooth and nail to hold their ground. Afi and Havy had done everything they could to stop the Dominion's advance, but they both knew that the odds were stacked against them. Their resources were dwindling, their defenses barely holding, and yet they fought on because that was all they had left. We can't keep this up, Afi muttered to Havy, his hands gripping the weapons console as the station trembled under the force of the Dominion's assault. He was sweating, his face a mask of focus, but the strain was clear in his eyes. We're running out of time. Earth's reinforcements are still too far away. Havy didn't respond right away. She was at another terminal, frantically trying to recalibrate the station's defenses to buy them more time. Her expression was taut, lips set in a hard line as she worked with a precision that was almost terrifying. Afi had watched her move through the chaos, and despite the situation, a part of him felt a deep admiration for her. She had evolved from the soldier she once was, from the weapon they had discarded, into something far more powerful, something he could fight alongside. We just need a few more minutes, she said finally, her voice low but determined. If I can get into their command ship systems, I can disable their communications, and give us a window to strike back. Afi nodded, though his chest tightened. We don't have that long, he said, his voice quiet but urgent. If we don't stop them now, we're finished. The station groaned beneath them again as another blast hit, shaking the walls and causing a blinding flash of light in the control room. Afi instinctively ducked, covering his eyes from the flare. But when he looked up again, his eyes widened. The station's outer hull was beginning to crack. The Dominion's fire had begun to break through the shields. Their time was running out. We can't let them get to the core, Afi said, his voice tight. He looked to Havy, his gaze serious. You've done enough, Havy. You've bought us more time than I ever could have hoped for. But this is it. Havy's eyes flickered to him, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor. Her face softened, though the determination never wavered. I won't leave you, she said firmly, her voice unwavering. We do this together, you and me. We finish this together. Afi nodded, even though part of him feared that this might be the last stand they had. He had seen soldiers die for causes that felt smaller than this one. He had fought in wars where the stakes were high, but nothing had ever felt like this. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something more. They were fighting to reclaim their lives, to claim their right to exist free from those who would control them. All right, Afi said, his voice softening. But we can't just fight them off. We need to do something that will stop them from coming back. We need to hit them hard, make them rethink their approach. Havy's eyes locked onto his. You're talking about sacrificing the core, she said, understanding his plan before he even fully voiced it. Afi nodded, his throat tight. We overload the reactor. It's the only way to create the kind of chaos that will make them retreat. It'll wipe out their communications for good, disable their tracking systems. But you'll be trapped here, Havy finished for him, her voice soft, but filled with the kind of sadness that only came with understanding. You're going to destroy the station. Afi didn't reply immediately. He couldn't. The truth was too raw, too painful. But he had always known that this was a possibility. He had known the risks when they started this fight. The Dominion would not stop until they got what they wanted, and sometimes that meant making impossible choices. I'll hold them off, Afi said, finally looking at her. I'll buy you the time you need to disable their core systems. I'll make sure you get away. You can't stay here. Havy shook her head, her eyes narrowing in defiance. I'm not leaving you. We've been through too much for me to just walk away. Afi reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and warm. You have to, Havy. The mission is bigger than us. You have the power to stop them. You have to make it to Earth. Let them know what the Dominion is really capable of. They won't stop at one outpost. This is just the beginning. Havy swallowed hard, her jaw clenched. And you, I'll make sure the way is clear for you, Afi said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I'll hold them back, keep them distracted long enough for you to make it to safety. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The gravity of the decision pressed down on both of them, but they both knew what had to be done. They had come this far and there was no turning back now. I'll do it, Havy said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. I won't fail you. Afi gave her a small, reassuring smile. I know you won't. You've already proven that. Now go. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to get out. Havy nodded, turning away to head toward the station's main reactor. Afi watched her go, a part of him wanting to reach out and stop her, to keep her by his side. But he knew she was right. This was their only chance to stop the Dominion. Their only chance to make sure they didn't just become another footnote in the Empire's endless campaign of destruction. As Havy moved toward the core, Afi took his position near the main control console, locking onto the Dominion's advancing fleet. The distance between them and reinforcements was still too great. They had no time to waste. He could already hear the sound of enemy ships closing and the hum of their weapons, charging up for the final strike. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He had made his choice. For freedom, for Havy, for the future. He would give everything. The countdown began. The blinding flash of the explosion rocked the station, throwing Afi back his body, weightless as the blast sent shockwaves through the outpost. The station's core had overloaded, erupting in a wave of energy that ripped through everything in its path. For a split second, Afi was suspended in time, the light of the explosion burning into his vision as he was flung violently through the air. His body slammed against the broken walls of the station, and then everything went dark. The cold of space flooded his senses as he was thrust into the vacuum, the debris of the exploded outpost swirling around him. Afi's breath caught in his chest, but the lack of air made it hard to breathe. The last thing he remembered was the blast, and then nothing. Havy watched in horror as the explosion engulfed the station, the light too bright for even her enhanced eyes to process. She shielded her face, feeling the intense heat from the blast as the shock wave tore through the station's structural integrity. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, then cracked. She held on to a nearby console, her heart racing as the chaos unfolded around them. "Afi," she shouted into the ear-splitting noise, her voice barely audible. But there was no answer. The explosion consumed everything, everything except for her. The station's lights flickered, once then went out entirely. Havy was left in the inky blackness of space, the stars outside the broken windows cold and distant. Her heart pounded as she looked desperately for Afi, but there was no sign of him. The debris from the explosion was everywhere, floating in the cold void. She moved quickly, scanning the wreckage around her. "Afi," she called again, louder this time, her voice full of fear. "Please answer me." Her mind was racing as she used her training to move through the wreckage, pushing off from floating debris and scanning every broken piece of the station. The blast had been powerful enough to tear through entire sections of the outpost, but there was no trace of Afi, no body, no sign of movement. The station's wreckage spun around her in an eerie dance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lost him. Afi had been right there with her, fighting beside her. She had trusted him with everything. They had fought for each other, but now with no one else around and the station drifting into the void, it seemed like the fight had been for nothing. Then, as if fate had decided to take everything from her, she saw it. A flash of metal, something caught on the wreckage, a body hurtling toward a nearby abandoned station floating in the distance. Her breath hitched in her chest. No, it can't be. But it was. The body was Afi. He had been thrown from the explosion, and she could see him floating away in the debris, his body limp and unresponsive, heading straight for the abandoned space station. "No!" Havy screamed, pushing herself off the remains of the outpost and gliding toward the abandoned station, her heart in her throat. She couldn't believe it. He can't be gone. He can't. She reached the small station, using her remaining strength to grab hold of the airlock and pull herself inside. The station's systems were long offline, but it was still intact enough to offer shelter. She floated into the dim, derelict hallway, her eyes scanning desperately for Afi. She found him in a dark corner, crumpled against the wall, his face pale, his body unresponsive. She rushed to him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. His heart was still beating weakly, but it was there. He was alive. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. His body was covered in bruises and burns from the explosion, his clothes torn. The damage had been severe, and it was clear that without immediate help, he wouldn't survive much longer. Havy's mind raced. She couldn't afford to lose him, not now. But there was no time. She was alone. She had no tools, no medical supplies, and no way to contact anyone. The rest of the Dominion fleet could be on them any minute. They had to escape. They had to leave this place. Havy's heart ached as she gently placed her hands on Afi's chest, pushing a desperate surge of energy into him. She could feel his body stirring slightly as her powers, the ones she had spent so much time learning to control, wrapped around him like a blanket. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Not for him. The sound of Dominion ships approaching cut through the silence like a knife. Havy's head snapped up and she looked toward the distant stars. They were coming in fast. She had no time to wait. No time to think. "Afi!" she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Please don't leave me now." She lifted him, using the last of her strength to carry him toward the station's emergency shuttle bay. She had to get him to safety. She had to. There was no other option. She couldn't let him go, not after everything they had been through. As the shuttle bay doors hissed open, she felt her pulse quicken. Her heart was still pounding in her chest as she placed Afi gently inside one of the shuttle's seats. She barely had time to strap herself in before the engines roared to life. The last thing she saw as they blasted off into space was the fading wreckage of the outpost, the memory of their final stand a flicker in the distance. The Dominion fleet was still coming, but Havy wasn't going to let them win. She had one mission now: to keep Afi alive, to get him back to Earth, and to make sure the Dominion understood what they had started. She was no longer running. She was fighting for Afi, for herself, for everything they had fought to protect. And as the shuttle shot into the stars, leaving the wreckage behind, Havy vowed that she wouldn't let the sacrifice of everything they had done be in vain. They would fight together or apart until the Dominion was no more. The sound of the Dominion fleet closing in filled the small control room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The once vibrant station was now a shell of its former self, its systems strained and barely holding together after the massive explosion. Afi and Havy had fought relentlessly, but the tide of battle was rapidly turning against them. The Dominion was overwhelming in numbers and power, and despite their best efforts, they were being pushed back. "How much longer do we have?" Havy's voice was steady, but there was an edge of panic in it that she couldn't hide. Her eyes flickered to the flashing alerts on the console in front of her, each one a new warning of the station's failing systems. Afi didn't look up from the terminal, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. "Not much," he muttered. The weapon systems were almost completely drained, and their shields were down to critical levels. The Dominion ships were closing in fast, their firepower so concentrated that it felt like the station itself was being torn apart with each passing second. "We can't keep this up, Afi." Havy shouted, her frustration growing as she slammed her fist on the console. "We've already lost half the station's defense grid. There's no way we can win this battle. We're outnumbered and we're not giving up." Afi interrupted, his voice tight, though there was no denying the exhaustion in it. His hands trembled as he worked, but his eyes remained focused on the incoming fleet. "We can't let them have this station, not after everything we've done." "But we're running out of options," Havy said, her voice softer now. "There's nothing left. The Dominion's going to tear this place apart if we don't." Afi's gaze softened as he looked at her. For a moment there was a flicker of understanding between them, a shared recognition that this was the end. They had fought so hard, so relentlessly, but the truth was undeniable. They were out of time. "I can't let you die here, Havy," Afi said quietly, his voice filled with something he hadn't said before. Something raw, something honest. "Not after everything we've been through." "What are you talking about?" Havy's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean we're in this together? We'll fight until the end. I'm not leaving you." But Afi wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. He couldn't let her die because of him, not when she had so much more to offer, so much more to live for. She had fought for herself, for her freedom, but it was time to make the ultimate choice. "I'm not letting you die for me," Afi said, his voice hardening with resolve. "The Dominion is after you, not me. And if I can buy you enough time to get to safety, if I can make sure you make it out of here, then that's what I have to do." "No, Afi," Havy protested, shaking her head. "We're in this together. You can't—" But Afi was already moving. He grabbed the emergency override controls, typing in the final codes for the station's core systems. The countdown was beginning. The last step in the plan he had kept hidden from her, hidden from everyone. It wasn't the choice he had wanted to make, but it was the only one left. "Afi, no," Havy cried, reaching out to him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "You have to survive," he said quietly, his voice breaking as he turned to face her one last time. "I can't go with you, but you can. You have to take what we started and finish it." Afi's finger hovered over the final command to trigger the overload in the station's core. The plan was risky, far too risky, but it was their only chance. The explosion would send a shockwave powerful enough to cripple the Dominion's fleet, but only if it detonated in the next few moments. Only if the command was issued now. "No," Havy whispered, stepping toward him. "Please, Afi, you can't do this." But Afi wasn't listening. He pressed the final button, and the station's core started to hum with power, the countdown ticking down with a terrifying precision. "It's done," Afi said, his voice low but resolute. "The Dominion won't know what hit them." Havy stared at him, her eyes wide with horror. "Afi, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You can't—" But Afi only looked at her one last time, his gaze softening for just a moment before it hardened with the knowledge that there was no other way. "You can fight, Havy," He said his words carrying a weight that only she could understand. You've always been stronger than you think, but I need you to live. I need you to make sure this isn't for nothing. The room trembled as the core powered up the walls, creaking under the strain. The sound of the Dominion fleet moving in was deafening now, the promise of their firepower closing in fast. Afi knew that he wouldn't make it out of this. He knew that this was his final stand. But Havy would survive. She had to. The seconds ticked by as the core continued its countdown, the power building toward an inevitable explosion. Havy reached out one last time, but Afi stepped back, his face filled with both sorrow and resolve. Go, Havy, he whispered. Don't let their victory be ours. With one final desperate look at him, Havy turned and sprinted toward the shuttle bay, her footsteps echoing in the quiet chaos of the station. She didn't look back, but her heart broke with every step. She wasn't leaving him behind. Not like this. Not after everything they had been through. But Afi's sacrifice was their only chance. And as the station's countdown hit its final seconds, she knew that it was already too late. The explosion rocked the station, the force of it sending a shockwave that tore through the Dominion's fleet, sending their ships into disarray. The last thing Havy saw before the blast consumed everything around her was the light of the explosion reflected in Afi's eyes, a final act of defiance, a final act of love, and then everything went dark. Havy awoke to the silence of space, the shuttle's emergency lights flickering on as the debris from the explosion drifted by. She was alone, the wreckage of the outpost far behind her. Her chest was tight with grief, her mind racing with the images of Afi's final moments. But even as the tears filled her eyes, something else burned deep within her, anger and a resolve that she had never felt before. Afi's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. She would make sure of it. The Dominion would pay. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. Havy sat in the cockpit of the shuttle, her hands gripping the control panel, her eyes staring out into the abyss of space. The remnants of the Lone Outpost drifted behind her, a wreckage of everything they had fought for. The Dominion fleet had retreated, their ships scattered in the wake of the explosion that had torn through the outpost. It had been the last desperate measure, one that Afi had chosen. He had sacrificed everything so that Havy could live, so that their fight for freedom wouldn't die with the station. Her heart felt heavy, a weight of grief and loss pressing down on her. She hadn't expected to survive. She hadn't expected to be alone. The explosion had taken so much. Afi, her partner, her friend, her reason for fighting, and yet here she was, flying alone through the stars, carrying with her the remnants of their shared mission. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know what to do without him. The shuttle's engines hummed quietly, the only sound in the vast empty space. Havy looked at the navigation display, trying to think of somewhere, anywhere that could offer peace. Somewhere that could give her the solace she so desperately needed after the battle, after everything that had happened. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could ever find peace again. The loss of Afi, his sacrifice, hung over her like a dark cloud. She had to move on. For him, for what they had fought for. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, saw the way he had looked at her in his final moments, urging her to escape, to survive. And she knew deep down that she couldn't move forward without him. The shuttle drifted toward an uncharted planet, one that Havy had spotted on the star map. It was small, barren, and isolated, a place that seemed as distant from the horrors of the war as possible, a place where she could bury her grief and maybe, just maybe, start to rebuild. She needed time, time to breathe, time to reflect. As the shuttle touched down on the planet's surface, Havy stepped out, her boots crunching on the dry, dusty ground. The air was thin, and the wind carried a faint smell of rust and earth. She stood there for a moment, gazing out at the desolate landscape, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. She had survived, but at what cost? Her heart was torn. She had kept moving, kept pushing forward after the explosion, because that's what Afi would have wanted. But the loneliness was suffocating. The silence around her mirrored the silence in her heart. She walked for hours, lost in her thoughts, trying to piece together what her life had become after everything she had lost. It was as she reached the edge of a small valley that she saw something in the distance. A figure, a silhouette standing against the horizon. She blinked, her breath catching in her chest, certain she was seeing things, imagining it. But as the figure grew closer, her heart stopped altogether. Afi! she whispered, barely believing the word as it left her lips. The man before her was battered and bruised, his clothing torn and stained with blood. But it was unmistakably him. Afi, alive. He was standing there leaning against a large rock for support, his breathing shallow but steady. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You're alive!" Havy managed, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. "I thought you—" Afi's lips curled into a weak, painful smile. "I should be dead," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I guess I'm not that easy to get rid of." Tears welled in Havy's eyes as she ran toward him, her legs shaking with the intensity of her emotions. She reached him and gently cupped his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the familiar features of the man she had thought she had lost forever. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. You sacrificed yourself." "For me." Afi's hand found hers, his grip weak but steady. "I had to," he said softly, his voice filled with exhaustion. "But I never really left you, Havy. I just hung on. I couldn't let go, not after everything." Havy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The weight of everything, the explosion, the sacrifice, the loss seemed to crash down on her all at once. But here he was, alive, against all odds. She had thought she was alone in this vast, cold universe, but now with Afi by her side, the weight in her chest began to lift just a little. "You're here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I thought I would never feel whole again." Afi smiled, his eyes tired, but filled with the same warmth that had always been there. "Maybe we don't have to be whole to move forward," he said gently. "Maybe we can just keep going. Together." Havy looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love, grief, and newfound hope. The future was still uncertain, the war still far from over, but in this moment there was something more important, something that had been born from their shared struggle, hope and love. "I don't know what comes next," Havy said, her voice soft but resolute, "but I know that as long as we're together, we have a chance." Afi nodded, his hand reaching out to pull her closer, his strength returning little by little. "We'll fight. For the future. For freedom. But most of all, for each other." Together they stood there, looking out at the barren landscape. The battle had been long, and it was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Havy felt the promise of something new on the horizon. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. And as long as they were together, they could face whatever came next. The Dominion hadn't won, not yet. And as Havy and Afi walked forward side by side, they knew they would never stop fighting for themselves, for the freedom they had fought for, and for the future they would build together. The journey ahead was uncertain, but as Havy and Afi stood side by side, their silhouettes cast long shadows against the horizon of the desolate planet, something had changed. The past, the pain, the battles, the losses was no longer an anchor holding them down. Together they had faced the worst, and in the ashes of their struggle, they had found a bond forged in the fires of adversity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue across the empty landscape, they walked forward, each step carrying them further from the wreckage of their past. It had been a long road filled with darkness, fear, and uncertainty, but now for the first time the path ahead seemed clearer. "Where do we go from here?" Havy asked, her voice quiet, almost reflective. Her gaze was fixed on the vast expanse before them, the stars twinkling faintly overhead. The galaxy still teemed with threats, with darkness lurking in the corners, but for the first time she felt the stirring of something new, something worth fighting for. Afi turned to her, his expression softening as he took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the present. "We don't know yet," he said, his voice low but filled with the kind of certainty only experience could give. "But we do know that we're not running anymore. We're choosing to fight for the life we want." Havy nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet, resilient hope. For freedom. For a future that's ours to decide. Together they had torn through the illusion of their limitations. The Dominion had once seemed invincible, their empire vast and oppressive. But now, with their hearts united and their purpose clear, they knew the Dominion's hold was not eternal. They weren't just pawns in some grand design anymore. They were fighters, survivors, and together they could change the course of their fate. "Whatever happens," Afi continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that conveyed everything they had shared, everything they had fought for. We'll face it together, you and me. The weight of their journey, the sacrifices, the pain, and the victories, all wrapped up in those words. It wasn't just about survival now. It wasn't about escape or hiding. It was about rebuilding, creating something better. A future where the past could no longer define them. Heavy squeezed his hand, the simple gesture carrying more meaning than any words could express. She knew in that moment that no matter what the galaxy had in store for them, they would find a way through it. Together. As the stars shimmered overhead, a promise was made without words. It was a promise to never stop fighting, not just for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all who had been oppressed by the Dominion's tyranny. It was a promise to build a world where the past would not dictate the future. We've got a long road ahead, Havy said, looking back toward the vast emptiness of space where their enemies still lurked. But we'll make it. We'll fight every step of the way. Afi smiled softly, the weight of the world still on his shoulders. But there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, a spark of hope. We will, he agreed, and we'll make sure it counts. As they continued walking, the silence between them was comfortable. It wasn't an empty silence, but one filled with understanding. The battle for the galaxy wasn't over, but for the first time, Havy felt like they had a real chance at winning. Not just a fight against the Dominion, but a fight for their right to live freely, to choose their destiny. They had lost so much, but in each other, they had found something that could never be taken away: love, hope, and the courage to rebuild. And together they would do whatever it took to build a future that was theirs. The stars above them stretched out into the infinite, a universe full of possibility and wonder. And as Havy and Afi walked toward whatever lay ahead, they knew that no matter the darkness that remained, they were no longer alone. Their story was just beginning. The journey of Havy and Afi is one of sacrifice, resilience, and hope set against the backdrop of a galaxy torn through betrayals, battles, and the ultimate sacrifice of Afi. They both learn the true meaning of strength and love. Afi's selfless act to save Havy sets the stage for a new chapter in their lives, as they both find renewed purpose and a path forward despite the overwhelming odds. The Dominion may have been a vast and oppressive force, but it could not crush thee in the end. Havy and Afi's journey is not just about defeating the Dominion, but about reclaiming their future, forging a new world in which they define their own fate. Together they stand strong, no longer just survivors, but fighters for freedom, hope, and love, a bond that will carry them through whatever challenges the future holds. Their story is just beginning.